In the summer of 1683, Vienna stood on the precipice of disaster. This critical frontier city, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, became the stage for a confrontation that would not only decide its own fate, but also alter the course of European history. The Ottoman Empire, a vast and powerful force that had been expanding steadily westward for centuries, now set its sights on Vienna as the gateway to the heart of Europe. For the defenders, the situation seemed dire. Roughly 5,000 soldiers and a mix of civilian militia faced a colossal Ottoman army estimated at 50,000 or more. The staggering disparity in numbers framed the battle as an impossible siege. Vienna was not just a city, it was a symbol of European resistance to Ottoman expansion. Its walls and gates had endured previous assaults, but none as overwhelming or as consequential as this. The Ottoman army, under the command of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, brought with it the full might of empire: heavy artillery, expert sappers ready to tunnel beneath the city walls, and a sprawling force confident in swift victory. Yet inside those walls, an eclectic group of defenders, led by Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, prepared to hold Vienna's fate in their hands. How could such a small force withstand a siege against overwhelming odds? Why did this battle matter far beyond the silent stones of Vienna's ramparts? These questions hung heavy in the air, setting the dramatic stakes for what was to come. Starhemberg and his men were not just defending a city, they were standing as the last barrier between Ottoman domination and the survival of Central Europe. The defenders faced not only a vastly superior enemy, but also the harsh realities of siege warfare: dwindling supplies, the constant threat of mining and bombardment, and the psychological weight of being vastly outnumbered. Civilians joined the fight, blurring the line between combatant and non-combatant, driven by desperation and a shared resolve. Fried food and sacks filled with earth strengthened the walls, while messages were sent out for reinforcements that seemed distant and uncertain. On the other side, the Ottoman commanders projected confidence. Their empire, at its territorial peak, had crushed armies before, yet they underestimated the will and resourcefulness of Vienna's defenders. The siege dragged on, revealing cracks in the Ottoman plans and a resilience they had not anticipated. Behind these military movements lay larger forces at play: religious conflict, dynastic rivalry, and the shifting balance of power in Europe. Vienna's stand was more than a military engagement. It was a collision of civilizations, ideologies, and ambitions. The outcome would ripple through history, raising hopes and reshaping alliances. As this story unfolds, the tension between overwhelming odds and desperate courage, between strategic calculation and raw human will keep us moving toward an epic clash that defined an era. This is the tale of how a few thousand rebels stood tall against an empire's might and held the line against seemingly impossible odds. The Siege of Vienna in 1683 is not just a story of stones and soldiers. It is a testament to resilience, strategy, and the unyielding spirit of those who fight for survival against the odds. The question that remains is, how did these 5,000 defenders withstand the might of 50,000 attackers, and what does their struggle teach us about the limits of power and the strength of resistance? This is the story of the Impossible Siege. In the summer of 1683, the Ottoman Empire unleashed one of its largest military forces to date in its relentless push toward Vienna, a jewel of Central Europe and a critical symbol of the Habsburgs' power. The campaign was led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, whose confidence was rooted in years of successful expansion and siege warfare. His army, bolstered by allies and mercenaries, numbered as many as 150,000 troops according to some records, although about 50,000 were directly engaged in the siege itself. This vast force represented the Ottoman war machine at its peak, equipped with heavy artillery, expert sappers, and a well-coordinated command structure. Kara Mustafa's strategy was systematic and brutal. The Ottomans commenced siege operations on July 14, 1683, quickly encircling Vienna. He ordered his forces to capture the outer fortifications through a series of heavy bombardments, mining operations, and relentless assault. These artillery barrages, operated by dozens of massive bronze cannons, were intended to pulverize the city's ancient walls, many of which were already decayed and vulnerable. Ottoman sappers began tunneling beneath the fortifications to plant explosives, aiming to create breaches where soldiers could pour through. However, the defenders were not passive victims. Vienna had prepared for siege under the direction of Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, an experienced and unyielding commander. The city's 5,000 defenders included seasoned soldiers, militia, and armed civilians, all driven by a desperate will to survive. Anticipating mining attempts, Viennese engineers dug countermines to intercept and collapse the Turkish tunnels. To reinforce the degrading walls, defenders hammered massive tree trunks into the ground, significantly enhancing their resistance against bombardment and mining. This contest between siege tactics showcased stark contrasts. The Ottoman forces possessed superior numbers, sophisticated artillery, and siege experience dating back centuries, but the defenders used ingenuity and determination to stabilize their vulnerable position. The city boasted about 370 cannons, outnumbering the Ottoman field pieces and medium cannons, providing some artillery parity despite the disparity in troop strength. The Ottomans also used trenches and earthworks to protect their troops as they advanced toward Vienna's walls, patiently tightening their grip day by day. Their battle formations were classical and meticulously organized. Heavy infantry set in pike and shot formations provided a coordinated defense against the city's sortie attempts, while elite janissary units awaited opportunities to exploit any breach. Inside Vienna, shortages mounted. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies dwindled as the siege lengthened. Starhemberg's troops fought near the limits of endurance, continuously repairing walls and repelling Ottoman sorties. Civilians played a crucial role, building barricades, caring for the wounded, and even taking up arms. The psychological burden was immense. The defenders knew relief forces were gathering, but remained uncertain if help would arrive in time. Throughout this brutal siege, the Ottomans underestimated the defenders' resilience and the strategic difficulties posed by Vienna's fortifications and the defenders' countermeasures. Despite their superior firepower and manpower, Ottoman assaults repeatedly failed to secure decisive breaches. Each failed attempt sapped their morale and stretched their logistics thin. This struggle was a collision of two vast military systems: the sprawling, multifaceted Ottoman war machine featuring artillery, sappers, and cavalry superiority, versus a determined, far smaller force that leveraged urban defense, countermining, and sheer will. The siege was not merely a battle of arms, but of patience, ingenuity, and endurance. As weeks passed, the advancing and digging slowly took their toll on the city, but Vienna's defenders bought critical time by holding firm. This time was necessary for the arrival of a relief force led by King John III Sobieski of Poland, which would soon challenge the overwhelming might of the Ottoman siege. The stage was set. A desperate city clinging to survival faces an empire's full fury. This is the story of the Ottoman siege's strategy and might, and how a smaller, determined force resisted a seemingly unstoppable war machine. At the heart of Vienna's desperate resistance stood Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, the resolute commander tasked with holding the city against overwhelming Ottoman forces. Starhemberg was a seasoned military officer with experience in siege warfare, but even his skills faced a daunting challenge: defending a city with around 5,000 defenders against an enemy force nearly 10 times their number. This band of defenders was a diverse mix: professional soldiers, militia, armed citizens, and volunteers, all united by a fierce determination to defend their homes and faith. Starhemberg's leadership became the linchpin of the city's defense. He was known for his strict discipline, tactical ingenuity, and unshakable resolve. He understood that victory would not come through brute force but by exploiting Vienna's fortifications, maintaining morale, and using every resource wisely. Despite the scarcity of food, ammunition, and manpower, Starhemberg instilled a fighting spirit among his men, turning fear into defiance. The core of Vienna's defenders was the city garrison, composed of regular infantry and artillery units. These were well-trained soldiers, experienced in fortification warfare, but fewer than needed to man all the walls and bastions effectively. To fill the gaps, Starhemberg mobilized the city's militia, composed primarily of burghers, craftsmen, and common citizens trained hastily in arms. Volunteers, farmers, shopkeepers, and ordinary men joined the militia ranks, motivated not by military duty, but by the urgent need to defend their families and city. These defenders were equipped with a variety of weapons, from muskets and pikes to halberds, and even farming tools repurposed for combat. The artillery complement included around 370 cannons, outgunning the Ottoman siege artillery in number, which proved critical in contesting the bombardments. Civilians played crucial roles beyond fighting. Women supplied food and ammunition, tended to the wounded, and repaired walls battered by relentless Ottoman fire. Morale was fragile but held firm, thanks largely to Starhemberg's leadership and the defenders' shared resolve. Stories of small but fierce sorties, quick, brutal attacks against Ottoman trenches and sappers, became testimonies of courage and defiance. Each night, as Ottoman miners worked below, the defenders' countermining teams worked tirelessly to intercept and collapse tunnels, turning the subterranean war into a deadly cat-and-mouse game. Despite material shortages, the defenders adapted with creativity. Earth-filled sacks were piled against damaged walls, makeshift barricades raised, and damaged cannon repositioned strategically. Starhemberg coordinated limited resources to maintain key defensive points, especially the city's northern and western gates, which were repeatedly targeted by Ottoman assaults. The civilians of Vienna, often overlooked in traditional military narratives, emerged as unsung heroes. Their determination to hold their city was palpable. Father and son stood side by side on the walls, faith and survival intertwined in their struggle. This blend of professional soldiers, militia, and civilian fighters created a resilient defense that, despite fatigue, dwindling supplies, and constant bombardment, refused to break. This human dimension, the courage of ordinary men and women under extraordinary pressure, is what transformed the siege into more than just a military engagement. It set the stage for a legendary underdog story, where a small force held firm against a great empire, not just with weapons, but with an unyielding spirit of survival. Starhemberg's defenders bought precious time and withstood attacks that would have crushed lesser forces. Their sacrifice underscored the fierce intersection of leadership, morale, and collective will, highlighting why the Siege of Vienna remains a powerful story of resistance against overwhelming odds. On July 14, 1683, the Ottoman army under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha arrived at Vienna's gates, setting in motion one of the most dramatic sieges in European history. From the very outset, the city sensed the grinding weight of a protracted battle. The Ottoman forces, confident in their overwhelming numbers and superior artillery, began an intense bombardment aimed at breaking through the city's medieval walls. This bombardment was not merely about destruction, it was psychological warfare, intended to sap the defenders' morale with the relentless thunder of cannon fire shaking the city day and night. But Vienna's defenders, a mix of 5,000 soldiers and civilians under the unyielding leadership of Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, responded with fierce resolve. The sound of exploding shells was met with the pounding of repair hammers, as citizens and soldiers alike rushed to mend breaches in the walls and reinforce the bastions with earth-filled sacks and timber. The city's streets echoed with the cacophony of war, cries of alarm, orders shouted over the chaos, and the relentless grind of wheelbarrows ferrying stones and supplies. Despite the shocking disparity in manpower, the defenders mounted sorties, small-scale, fierce raids against Ottoman positions. These daring attacks aimed to disrupt the mining operations that threatened to collapse Vienna's defenses from beneath. Mining infiltrated the siege's shadowy underground battle. Ottoman sappers began digging tunnels toward the city walls, intending to place explosives to rupture the fortifications. Yet the Viennese defenders countered with their own teams, digging intercepting tunnels and engaging in subterranean combat. These deadly encounters beneath the ground were as brutal and nerve-wracking as the fighting above, with men working in darkness often facing sudden explosions or hand-to-hand battles miles beneath the surface. Outside the fortified walls, the impact of the siege rippled through the civilian population. Food shortages quickly became dire as supply lines were cut, forcing both soldiers and citizens to ration heavily. Illness spread amid the crowded conditions, and the psychological strain weighed heavily on all. The constant threat of bombardment kept many families huddled away from their homes, seeking shelter in cellars and tunnels. Starhemberg himself often toured the ramparts, urging his defenders and offering a steadfast symbol of leadership amid the ruin. The psychological endurance of the defenders was tested daily. While Ottoman morale soared with each blast from their cannons and each successive breach, the Viennese clung to hope, bolstered by Starhemberg's leadership and the knowledge that relief forces were being assembled. Civilians, including women and older men, contributed not just in repair work but also by tending to the wounded, carrying munitions, and providing food and water, bridging the gap between frontline soldiers and home-front survival. Despite intense pressure and numerous Ottoman assaults on weak points, Vienna's walls held. The defensive efforts were shaped by the terrain. Hills and the Danube River provided natural barriers, complemented by the city's defenses. The defenders' constant vigilance frustrated Ottoman plans for a quick conquest. Yet the toll was high. Each new day brought mounting casualties and suffering on both sides. The relentless Ottoman pressure was met by equal resilience within the city's gates, creating a drama of endurance against overwhelming odds. Each explosion, each raid, each repair was a test of will, shaping the siege into a protracted battle of attrition, not just military might. This early phase of the siege demonstrated the brutal reality of siege warfare, where victory demanded not only strategy and strength, but also extraordinary human endurance, sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit of a city refusing to fall. The Siege of Vienna, initially anticipated by the Ottomans as a swift victory, quickly evolved into a grueling test of endurance and strategy, marked by repeated setbacks and stubborn resistance. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha's confidence, rooted in the might of a vast Ottoman war machine, collided headlong with Vienna's defenders under Starhemberg, whose resourcefulness and tenacity repeatedly foiled Ottoman plans. What had been expected to be a triumphant campaign began to grind down into a war of attrition, punctuated by tactical frustration and missed opportunities. One of the most significant Ottoman failures revolved around their mining operations beneath Vienna's thick walls. Ottoman sappers had dug extensive tunnels aimed at placing massive gunpowder charges under key bastions, especially near the Borg Bastion, Lerbel Bastion, and the Borg Ravelin. In total, the Ottomans prepared around 10 mines, each capable of causing catastrophic breaches. However, the Viennese defenders, anticipating such subterranean warfare, mounted an effective countermining campaign. They dug intercepting tunnels beneath the attackers' tunnels, engaging in tense and deadly underground skirmishes that often ended with defenders collapsing enemy tunnels or disarming explosives. These countermining efforts dismantled many of the Ottoman attempts, neutralizing the threat of devastating explosions that could have toppled sections of the city walls. Despite these setbacks, the Ottomans launched repeated assaults to exploit any perceived weaknesses. On July 30, following a mine explosion near the Borg Bastion, elite Janissary troops led an assault that pushed the defenders back from some forward trenches. Yet Vienna's defenders, using strategically placed earthworks, chevaux de frise, and hastily built barricades, quickly halted their momentum. Starhemberg ordered a series of sorties to destroy Ottoman siege works and tunnels, although these often came at a high cost. Each sortie was a desperate gambit, sending tired men into peril to delay the Ottoman advance. The battle for the Covered Way and the Ravelin became a brutal slog of back-and-forth combat. Ottoman sappers, though skilled, faced relentless resistance and were increasingly hampered by Viennese artillery fire from the city's numerous cannons. These cannon not only blunted Ottoman assaults but also inflicted heavy casualties. Despite breaches caused by some mine explosions, defenders raced to close gaps with sandbags, timber, and men, holding the lines in what became a series of desperate last stands. As August wore on, the inadequacies of the Ottoman approach became more apparent. Logistical challenges mounted, supply lines stretched thin, and the fierce resistance coupled with the city's natural defensive advantages slowed their progress. The defenders' resilience was fueled not only by leadership and strategy, but also by sheer human determination. Civilians and soldiers alike endured constant bombardment, shortages, and disease, yet refused to yield. Ottoman morale began to waver under the weight of these frustrations. Their assaults that should have overwhelmed the outmatched defenders instead resulted in heavy losses with little gain. The repeated failures to create a decisive breach postponed their victory indefinitely, giving time for relief forces to organize and advance toward Vienna. They faced the psychological strain of a withering siege that wore down their once formidable confidence. Throughout September, Starhemberg's defense grew ever more strained, and the defenders had to abandon some outer works to consolidate inside stronger fortifications. Yet even as they yielded ground, they held key defensive positions that prevented any easy Ottoman entry into the heart of the city. The question of how long Vienna could hold became critical, an unfolding drama that tested the limits of leadership, morale, and military endurance. The gap between Ottoman expectations of a swift conquest and the reality of protracted resistance highlighted a classic underdog story, a smaller embattled force defying the might of one of history's most powerful empires. This phase of the siege underscored the complexity of siege warfare, where tactical setbacks and human factors often mattered as much as numerical superiority. The suffering inside Vienna increased, but so did resolve, setting the stage for the historic relief march that would ultimately decide the siege's fate. Vienna's prolonged resistance amidst Ottoman setbacks was not merely a matter of military fortune, but of perseverance, strategic ingenuity, and unyielding spirit. It was this combination that would turn the tide against the greatest empire of its day. As the siege of Vienna dragged into its 9th week, the city's defenders clung to a fragile hope. Relief was on its way. This hope lay in the form of a formidable Allied army, amassed under the command of King John III Sobieski of Poland, a seasoned military leader whose reputation as a tactician and cavalryman was well earned. Sobieski's arrival not only promised reinforcements for the battered defenders, but also the possibility of turning the tide against the overwhelming Ottoman force. The march of the relief army would become one of the most dramatic chapters in the battle's history, underscoring the high stakes and the precarious balance between survival and defeat. King John III Sobieski had long prepared for the moment when the Ottoman threat would encroach directly on Vienna. Bound by the 1683 Treaty of Warsaw, which forged a defensive alliance between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Habsburg Empire, Sobieski was committed to intervening should Vienna come under attack. Upon hearing news of the siege, he swiftly mobilized his forces from Krakow, assembling approximately 27,000 Polish soldiers, including his famed winged hussars, renowned heavy cavalry whose speed and devastating charge would later define the battle. Joined by the Bavarian and Saxon contingents under Charles of Lorraine and other German allies, the Allied relief army swelled to around 50,000 troops. The logistics of moving such a large force through mountainous terrain and dense forests toward Vienna posed significant challenges, but Sobieski's leadership was decisive. Under his command, the army undertook a perilous march through the Vienna woods, moving largely undetected by Ottoman reconnaissance. This maneuver required navigating narrow, difficult paths while transporting artillery pieces dismantled into wagons. The crossing of this wilderness took 2 grueling days, testing the endurance and discipline of the troops but preserving the element of surprise. Meanwhile, the Ottoman besiegers remained focused on breaching the city walls, unaware that a large Allied force was advancing. The arrival of the relief army was a beacon of hope for Vienna's defenders, lifting their morale at a critical juncture when supplies were dwindling and exhaustion mounting. Inside the walls, Starhemberg and his men prepared for the possibility of breaking the siege from within while awaiting reinforcements from without. As September progressed, the Allied army encamped near the Tulln Valley, approximately 30 kilometers northwest of Vienna. Sobieski used this time to coordinate battle plans with the German commanders, emphasizing a combined assault to dismantle the Ottoman siege lines. The strategy hinged on a multi-pronged attack. German infantry and cavalry would engage Ottoman forces along the Danube's right bank, while Sobieski's Polish cavalry would execute a surprise assault from the Vienna woods, a move that required precise timing and coordination. Sobieski, deeply devout and a charismatic leader, took moments amid planning to pray for victory, attending mass and seeking divine favor before the impending battle. His confidence inspired his troops, fueling their resolve to relieve Vienna and halt Ottoman expansion into Europe. The stakes were immense. Failure would doom the city and significantly shift the continent's balance of power, while success would mark a turning point in the Holy League's resistance against Ottoman incursions. The tension built as the Allied forces prepared for battle, their presence near Vienna signaling that the siege's end loomed. For the Ottomans, the prospect of facing a fresh, well-commanded enemy force compounded their frustrations from failed breaches and stout Viennese resistance. The impending confrontation now bore the weight of destiny for both sides. Sobieski's winged hussars, numbering roughly 14,000 horsemen, gained legendary status for their disciplined formation and devastating charge capability. Their arrival promised a swift hammer blow to the already strained Ottoman lines. Meanwhile, Allied infantry and artillery prepared to push Ottoman forces into disarray, ensuring a comprehensive assault. As the armies positioned for battle in early September, the relief army's arrival transformed the siege from a desperate defense into the decisive confrontation that would decide Vienna's fate and the future of Central Europe. The tension between hope and despair, preparation and chaos, forged a narrative of heroism and epic struggle that still resonates centuries later. The build-up to battle under Sobieski's command revealed the critical interplay of leadership, logistics, and morale. The relief force was more than soldiers marching to war. It was a symbol of defiance and unity for the beleaguered city, a potent roar of hope echoing across the siege lines and through the minds of defenders waiting anxiously behind Vienna's battered walls. Ultimately, the arrival and strategy of King John III Sobieski's relief army offered a lifeline to Vienna, elevating the siege from a grim struggle of survival to a grand stage for one of history's most dramatic and decisive battles. The morning of September 12, 1683, dawned with an uneasy stillness at Kahlenberg Mountain, overlooking the battered city of Vienna. After 2 grueling months of siege, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of Europe itself. The Ottoman Empire, still holding siege lines around Vienna, faced an unexpectedly large and determined relief force from the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, commanded by King John III Sobieski of Poland. This battle would culminate in the largest cavalry charge in history, featuring Sobieski's legendary winged hussars, and would mark a decisive turning point against Ottoman expansion. Before dawn, Ottoman forces launched an attack aimed at disrupting the deployment of the Holy League troops. Waves of skirmishers and cavalry probed the relief army's positions near Nussdorf, Heiligenstadt, and along the Danube. These early clashes tested the readiness of the Allies, who had marched hard to reach Vienna. Prince Charles of Lorraine led the imperial army's left wing, engaging heavily with Ottoman forces and gradually gaining ground after fierce fighting. The battle's pace was relentless, with both sides committing reserves to hold and seize key fortified villages and hills surrounding the city. By mid-morning, the Allied forces had established pressure on the Ottoman right flank, with Polish infantry advancing steadily. The Ottomans, despite their larger numbers, struggled under the weight of coordinated assaults from multiple directions, German forces outflanking from the northwest, Austrians pressing in from the north, and Polish troops advancing from the west. the defenders inside Vienna, under Starhemberg, simultaneously launched sorties against Ottoman siege works, adding to the chaos. As the day wore on, combat intensified around locations critical to the battle's outcome. The villages of Unterderbling and Oberderbling fell after a fierce struggle, tightening the noose around the Ottoman camp. By early afternoon, the Ottoman army was increasingly hemmed in, caught between advancing Allied forces and the resolute city defenders. The morale of Ottoman troops wavered as their hopes of final victory dimmed with the steady advance of the combined Christian armies. The climax approached in the late afternoon. The Polish winged hussars, approximately 14,000 strong, had held back until the moment was right. Known for their distinctive armor adorned with eagle feathers and their devastating charges, these elite cavalrymen were the spearhead of Sobieski's plan. Positioned deliberately on the wooded slopes of Kahlenberg Hill, the hussars launched a probing charge with about 120 riders at around 4:00 p.m., testing Ottoman defenses and probing for weaknesses. Though costly, this initial assault confirmed vulnerabilities and set the stage for the main attack. With a commanding cry, Sobieski